The ancient walls of Windsor Castle had witnessed centuries of royal secrets, but nothing quite like this. Behind closed doors, away from the watchful eyes of the media and the curious public, a conversation was about to take place that would reshape the future of the British royal family forever. When Prince Harry stepped onto British soil after months of absence, he expected many things. Perhaps awkward silences, maybe cold shoulders from certain family members. What he didn't expect was the united front that awaited him, led by two people he had once considered his closest allies within the royal circle. William and Catherine had spent weeks preparing for this moment. Their message was clear, their resolve unshakable, and their patience had finally reached its limit. The gloves were off, and this time there would be no diplomatic dancing around the truth. The prodigal prince was about to discover that some bridges, once burned, cannot be rebuilt with simple apologies and media-friendly gestures. What happened next would send shockwaves through the monarchy and force Harry to confront a reality he had been avoiding for far too long. This is the untold story of a family pushed to its breaking point, where love and duty collided in ways that would change everything forever. The wheels of the private jet touched down at Heathrow Airport on a grey Tuesday morning in October. Prince Harry gazed out of the small window at the familiar landscape of his homeland, feeling a mixture of emotions he couldn't quite untangle. It had been 8 months since his last visit to the United Kingdom, and the weight of everything that had transpired during his absence felt heavier than the London fog that hung in the air. His security detail was minimal compared to the old days, just 2 officers who maintained a respectful distance. Gone were the elaborate protocols and the red carpet treatment that had once been his birthright. Harry adjusted his simple navy blazer and ran a hand through his hair, now showing the first hints of grey at the temples. The man who stepped off that plane was different from the one who had left in such dramatic fashion years before. The drive through London's familiar streets felt like travelling through a museum of his own life. Every landmark held memories both bitter and sweet. As they passed Buckingham Palace, Harry couldn't help but glance toward the balcony where he had stood so many times as a child, waving to crowds below. Those innocent days seemed like someone else's life now. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from his American publicist, his wife's team, and various media contacts trying to get exclusive details about his visit. Harry ignored them all. This trip wasn't about public relations or image management. He had returned for his grandmother's memorial service, a private family affair to mark what would have been her 99th birthday. It was the kind of intimate gathering that transcended public feuds and media narratives, or so he had hoped. The hotel suite in central London felt anonymous and cold. Harry had specifically chosen not to stay at any royal residence, wanting to maintain his independence and avoid the complications that might arise from being under the same roof as family members who had barely spoken to him in months. He unpacked his single suitcase methodically, hanging up the dark suit he would wear to tomorrow's service. That evening, as he sat alone in his room reviewing the order of service that had been delivered by a palace aide, Harry's phone rang. The caller ID simply read, William. His finger hovered over the screen for several seconds before he answered, Harry. William's voice was formal, distant. Gone was any trace of the warmth that had once existed between the brothers who had faced the world together after their mother's death. William. Harry's response was equally guarded. We need to talk. Before tomorrow. Catherine and I think it would be best if we cleared the air before the family gathering. Harry felt his stomach tighten. I'm not sure that's necessary. Tomorrow should be about Granny, not about our issues. That's exactly why we need to talk tonight. William's tone was firm, leaving no room for negotiation. There are things that need to be said, and tomorrow is too important to risk any complications. Harry looked out of his hotel window at the busy London street below, watching ordinary people going about their ordinary lives, completely unaware that a conversation happening floors above them might reshape one of the world's oldest monarchies. Where? Harry asked finally. Kensington Palace. 9 o'clock. Just the 3 of us. The line went dead before Harry could respond. He stared at his phone, knowing that this conversation had been inevitable since the moment he had decided to return to England. The years of public statements, leaked stories, and carefully worded interviews had built a wall between him and his family that seemed impossible to scale. But perhaps William was right. Perhaps it was time to stop dancing around the truth and finally face it head-on. Harry changed into casual clothes and ordered room service, though he found himself unable to eat more than a few bites. His mind wandered to all the conversations he had imagined having with William and Catherine over the past few years, He had rehearsed arguments, prepared explanations, and crafted apologies that he had never gotten the chance to deliver. Now, faced with the reality of seeing them again, all those carefully planned words seemed inadequate. As 8:30 approached, Harry's car pulled up outside Kensington Palace. The familiar red brick building looked exactly the same, but everything else had changed. Security personnel he didn't recognize checked his identification at the gate. The gardens where he had once played with William looked perfectly manicured but somehow smaller than his memories suggested. Catherine met him at the door herself, which surprised him. She was dressed simply in dark jeans and a cream-colored sweater, her hair pulled back in a way that made her look younger than her years. Her smile was polite but cautious, the kind reserved for acquaintances rather than family members. "Harry," she said, stepping aside to let him enter, "thank you for coming." "Thank you for having me," he replied, the formality of their exchange highlighting just how far they had all drifted from each other. William appeared at the end of the hallway, and Harry was struck by how much his older brother had aged. The weight of his future responsibilities seemed to have settled permanently on his shoulders, giving him a gravitas that hadn't been there before. His hair was receding more noticeably, and there were lines around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and difficult decisions. They gathered in the sitting room that had once been their informal meeting place for family discussions. Catherine offered tea, which they all accepted, though Harry suspected they were all just buying time before diving into the conversation they had come here to have. "I want to start by saying that this isn't an ambush," William began once they were all seated, "but Catherine and I have been talking and we feel that some things need to be said clearly and directly." Harry nodded, setting down his teacup. "I'm listening." "The family has been patient," Catherine continued, her voice gentle but firm. "We've tried to understand your perspective, your need for independence, your desire to build a different life. But your recent actions and statements have crossed lines that we can't ignore anymore." Harry felt his defenses rising, but forced himself to remain calm. "What specifically are you referring to?" William leaned forward, his hands clasped together. "The interview last month where you questioned the monarchy's relevance in modern times. The book deal that apparently includes details about private family conversations. The constant stream of comments from your team about how poorly you were treated here." "I never meant to hurt the family," Harry said quietly. "I was trying to tell my truth." "Your truth," Catherine repeated, and there was something in her tone that made Harry look at her more closely. "Harry, do you understand that your truth isn't the only truth? That every story has multiple perspectives?" "Of course, but—" "No," William interrupted, more sharply than Harry had ever heard him speak.
"There's no but here."
"You left. That was your choice and we respected it, even when it was difficult. But leaving doesn't give you the right to continue attacking the institution and the people you left behind." The room fell silent except for the ticking of an antique clock on the mantelpiece. Harry felt the weight of their words settling over him like a heavy blanket. He had known this confrontation was coming, but hearing it laid out so directly was more painful than he had anticipated. "You're my brother," Harry said finally, looking directly at William. "Whatever our differences, whatever mistakes I've made, we're still family." William's expression softened slightly, but his resolve remained firm. "Yes, we're family. And because we're family, I'm going to tell you something that no one else will. You need to choose. You can't keep one foot in royal life and one foot out, while simultaneously criticizing everything about the institution you still want to be associated with." Catherine spoke up again, her voice carrying authority that Harry hadn't heard from her before. "Tomorrow you'll be with the family to honor your grandmother's memory. After that, you need to decide whether you want to be part of this family going forward or whether you want to continue on the path you've chosen." "What does that mean exactly?" Harry asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "It means that if you choose to continue with the public criticisms, the media campaigns, and the constant drama, then you need to do it completely separate from us," William explained. "No more appearing at family events when it's convenient for you. No more trading on royal connections while simultaneously denouncing them."
Harry felt a chill run down his spine.
"You're asking me to choose between my family and my voice."
"No," Catherine said firmly. "We're asking you to choose between being a private citizen who happens to be related to royals or being a public critic who uses family connections for personal gain."
"You can't be both." The conversation continued for another hour, touching on old wounds and recent disappointments. Harry found himself defending decisions he wasn't entirely sure he still believed in, while William and Catherine presented their case with a unity and clarity that surprised him. They had clearly planned this intervention carefully, But there was no malice in their approach, only a kind of exhausted determination. As Harry prepared to leave, William walked him to the door. "I want you to know that this isn't about punishment," he said quietly. "It's about protecting the family and the institution that will outlast all of us. But it's also about protecting you." "Protecting me from what?" "From yourself," William replied. "From the path you're on that seems to be making you increasingly unhappy, even if you won't admit it." As Harry's car pulled away from Kensington Palace, he stared back at the building where he had just received what felt like an ultimatum from the two people he had once been closest to in the world. Tomorrow's memorial service would be more than just a tribute to his grandmother. It would be a crossroads where he would have to decide what kind of future he wanted to build, and whether that future included the family he had been born into. The London streets were quieter now, and Harry found himself thinking about all the choices that had led him to this moment. In less than 24 hours, he would have to face not just his family, but himself, and decide whether the price of his independence had been worth everything he had lost along the way. The morning of the memorial service dawned crisp and clear, with autumn sunlight filtering through the windows of Harry's hotel room. He had barely slept, his mind replaying every word of the previous evening's conversation with William and Catherine. Their message had been delivered with surgical precision, leaving no room for misinterpretation. As he stood before the bathroom mirror, adjusting his black tie, Harry caught sight of his reflection and barely recognized the man looking back at him. The private chapel at Windsor Castle was small and intimate, exactly the kind of setting his grandmother would have preferred for such an occasion. As Harry's car approached the castle gates, he could see other family members arriving in their own vehicles. The familiar choreography of royal gatherings was still in place, but Harry felt like an outsider, watching a dance he no longer knew the steps to. King Charles was among the first to greet him, his embrace warmer than Harry had expected, but still carrying the weight of unspoken disappointment. His father looked older, more fragile somehow, as if the responsibilities of the crown were aging him at an accelerated pace. They exchanged brief pleasantries about Harry's journey and the weather, both avoiding the deeper conversations that needed to happen, but weren't appropriate for this moment. Princess Anne approached next, her expression unreadable as always. She had never been one for emotional displays, but Harry had always respected her directness. "Harry," she said simply, clasping his hand firmly. She would have been pleased you came. There was no judgment in her voice, only a matter-of-fact acknowledgement that transcended their current family dynamics. As they moved toward the chapel, Harry noticed how the family naturally grouped themselves. William and Catherine walked together with their children, presenting the unified front that had become their trademark. Edward and Sophie chatted quietly with other relatives, while Charles moved between groups, fulfilling his role as the family patriarch even in this private setting. Harry found himself walking alone, which felt symbolically appropriate given his current status within the family structure. He wasn't entirely isolated. Various cousins and more distant relatives nodded and spoke with him, but the invisible barriers created by years of public discord were clearly present. The chapel itself was beautiful in its simplicity. Flowers that had been his grandmother's favorites filled the space with gentle fragrance, and photographs from throughout her life were displayed on easels around the altar. Harry paused before one image that showed her with him and William as young boys, their faces bright with innocent joy. The photographer had captured a moment of pure happiness that seemed impossible to reconcile with the tensions that now defined their relationships. As the service began, Harry found himself seated in the second row, behind his father and stepmother, with William and Catherine directly across the aisle. The positioning felt deliberate, close enough to maintain family unity for any potential photographers, but distant enough to acknowledge the current realities of their relationships. The service itself was everything his grandmother would have wanted. Dignified, personal, and free from the pomp and circumstance that had defined so much of her public life. Various family members spoke about their memories, sharing stories that revealed the private woman behind the public figure. When it came time for Harry to speak, he found himself struggling with emotions he hadn't expected to feel so intensely. "My grandmother was many things to many people," Harry began, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his heart. "But to me, she was simply Granny. She was the person who taught me that duty and love weren't opposing forces, but two sides of the same coin. She showed me that it was possible to serve something larger than yourself while never losing sight of what made you human." As he spoke, Harry could feel the eyes of his family upon him, weighing his words for hidden meanings and future implications. He had prepared remarks about duty and service, but standing there in that intimate space, surrounded by people he loved despite everything that had happened between them, Those carefully crafted words felt inadequate. She would have wanted us to remember that family isn't just about blood or titles or traditions, he continued, deviating from his prepared text. It's about the choices we make to support each other, to forgive each other, and to find ways to move forward together even when we don't always agree on the path. The silence that followed his remarks felt heavy with unspoken possibilities. Harry returned to his seat, acutely aware that his words had been as much about the living family members in that chapel as they had been about the woman they were honoring. Catherine spoke next, her words carefully chosen and beautifully delivered. She talked about the grandmother-in-law who had welcomed her into the family with warmth and guidance, who had taught her that being royal was less about privilege and more about responsibility. Her speech was everything Harry's had not been: diplomatic, appropriate, and perfectly calibrated to avoid any controversial territory. William followed his wife, and his remarks were perhaps the most revealing of all. He spoke about the weight of carrying on his grandmother's legacy, about the challenge of honoring tradition while adapting to a changing world. But it was his final comments that seemed directed as much at Harry as at the memory of their grandmother. She taught us that sometimes love means making difficult decisions, William said, his voice carrying clear across the small chapel. That protecting the people and institutions we care about might require personal sacrifice, and that the mark of true character isn't avoiding difficult conversations, but facing them with honesty and courage. After the service, the family gathered in one of the castle's private dining rooms for a modest lunch. The conversation was subdued but not uncomfortable, touching on safe topics like the children's school activities and upcoming charitable events. Harry found himself talking with various relatives he hadn't seen in months, people who seemed genuinely pleased to see him, but also careful not to stray into controversial territory. It was during coffee that King Charles approached him with a suggestion. "Walk with me," his father said quietly, and Harry followed him out into the castle gardens, where they had wandered together countless times during his childhood. "Your speech was thoughtful," Charles began as they strolled along a familiar gravel path. She would have appreciated the sentiment about family. "I meant every word," Harry replied, and he realized that was true, despite everything. "I know you did. That's what makes this whole situation so difficult." Charles stopped walking and turned to face his younger son. "Harry, I want you to know that the door to this family has never been closed to you. But William and Catherine are right about needing clarity." Harry felt a knot forming in his stomach. "Dad, Let me finish," Charles said gently but firmly. "I love you. I will always love you, but I cannot continue to watch you tear yourself apart, and I cannot allow the institution I will soon lead to be constantly undermined by someone who is supposed to be one of its strongest supporters." They walked in silence for several minutes, passing through gardens that held decades of family memories. Harry thought about all the conversations he had imagined having with his father, all the explanations and justifications he had prepared. Now, faced with the reality of this moment, those arguments seemed less important than the simple truth of their relationship. "What are you asking me to do?" Harry finally asked. "I'm asking you to decide what you really want," Charles replied. "Not what your advisors tell you to want, not what plays well in the media, but what you actually want for your life and your future. And if what I want is to be able to speak freely about my experiences while still being part of this family?" Charles smiled sadly. "Then I'm afraid you're going to have to choose, because those two things appear to be mutually exclusive right now." As they made their way back toward the castle, Harry caught sight of William and Catherine through one of the windows. They were talking intently with several other family members, and even from a distance he could sense the unity of purpose that seemed to surround them. They had found a way to balance their personal desires with their public roles, creating a life that honored both their individual needs and their collective responsibilities. The afternoon wound down with careful goodbyes and promises to stay in touch that everyone knew were more politeness than genuine intention. As Harry prepared to leave, he found himself standing alone in the chapel for a few final moments. The flowers still filled the space with their gentle fragrance, and the photographs of his grandmother seemed to watch him with the same patient understanding she had shown throughout her long life. "I don't know what to do, Granny," he whispered to the empty chapel. "I thought I was doing the right thing, but now I'm not sure about anything anymore." As if in response to his words, a shaft of late afternoon sunlight broke through one of the stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns across the stone floor. Harry remembered his grandmother once telling him that the most difficult decisions were often the most important ones, and that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. His phone buzzed with a message from his security team, letting him know his car was ready. As Harry walked toward the chapel door, he turned back one final time. Tomorrow he would fly back to his life in America, but he knew that something fundamental had changed during these 24 hours in England. The conversations with William, Catherine, and his father had stripped away the comfortable narratives he had been telling himself about his situation. Now, as he stepped out into the fading daylight, Harry realized that he had a choice to make that would define not just his relationship with his family, but the entire direction of his life going forward. The question was whether he had the courage to make it. The flight back to Los Angeles felt longer than usual, giving Harry endless hours to reflect on everything that had transpired during his brief return to England. As the plane crossed time zones, he found himself suspended between two worlds, two versions of himself, and two completely different futures. The businessman in first class beside him was reading financial reports, completely unaware that the casually dressed man next to him was grappling with decisions that could reshape one of the world's oldest institutions. Harry's phone remained deliberately turned off throughout the flight. He knew that his wife, his advisors, and various media contacts would all want immediate debriefs about his family interactions, but he wasn't ready for those conversations yet. Instead, he stared out of the small window at the vast Atlantic Ocean below and tried to untangle the competing voices in his head. William's words echoed repeatedly. You need to choose. The simplicity of that statement was both its power and its cruelty. For years, Harry had believed he could have it all. Independence and family connection, personal freedom and royal privilege, private citizen status and public platform. The conversation at Kensington Palace had shattered those comfortable assumptions with surgical precision. When the plane finally touched down at LAX, Harry felt the familiar California sunshine on his face, but none of its usual warmth seemed to penetrate the chill that had settled in his chest. His American security team was waiting with practiced efficiency, and soon he was being driven through the sprawling Los Angeles traffic toward the home he had built with such hope and determination. The house was exactly as he had left it, but everything felt different now. His wife greeted him at the door with enthusiasm and curiosity about his trip, but Harry found himself struggling to match her energy. How could he explain that a simple family memorial service had become an ultimatum that threatened to redefine their entire life? How did it go? She asked as they sat in their living room, the same space where they had planned their departure from royal life with such certainty and excitement. It was complicated, Harry replied, and then spent the next hour trying to describe conversations and emotions that seemed to lose their clarity the more he attempted to explain them. His wife listened carefully, asking thoughtful questions and offering support, but Harry could sense her growing concern as he recounted his brother's firm stance and his father's gentle but unmistakable pressure. This wasn't the homecoming either of them had anticipated. "So what are you going to do?" she asked finally, echoing the question that had been haunting Harry since he left Windsor Castle. "I don't know," he admitted, and the honesty of that statement was both liberating and terrifying. Over the following weeks, Harry found himself caught in a strange limbo. His scheduled public appearances continued as planned, but he struggled to summon his usual passion for the causes and projects that had driven him since leaving England. When he spoke about mental health awareness or veteran support, the words felt hollow compared to the authentic connection he had felt with his family during those difficult conversations at the memorial service. His team of advisors, publicists, and lawyers maintained their busy schedules of strategic planning and media coordination. Book promotion events were finalized, interview opportunities were evaluated, and the carefully constructed narrative of his independent life continued to unfold according to plan. But Harry felt increasingly disconnected from all of it, like an actor who had forgotten why he had wanted to play this particular role in the first place. The breaking point came during a planning meeting for his upcoming autobiography promotion tour. His publisher was enthusiastic about the revelations and intimate family details that would generate headlines and drive sales. His publicist was focused on maintaining his image as a truth-teller who had been brave enough to challenge an outdated institution. His legal team was ensuring that every word was protected from potential lawsuits. But as Harry sat in that conference room, surrounded by people whose livelihoods depended on his willingness to continue sharing private family moments with the public, he felt a profound sense of disconnection from the man he had once been. When had telling his truth become a business model? When had his pain become a product to be packaged and sold? "I need some time to think," Harry announced suddenly, interrupting a detailed discussion about which television interviews would reach the most valuable demographic targets. His team exchanged glances that spoke of deadline pressures and contractual obligations. "Of course," his publicist said smoothly, "but we really need to finalize these decisions by the end of the week to stay on schedule." "Then we'll have to adjust the schedule," Harry replied, standing up from the conference table. I'm not making any more commitments until I figure some things out. That evening, Harry found himself walking alone on the beach near his home, something he had done countless times since moving to California, but never with such a sense of urgency. The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly before him, its rhythmic waves providing a soundtrack for the thoughts that had been building inside him for weeks. He thought about his grandmother and the values she had tried to instill in him throughout his childhood. Service, duty, dignity, and discretion. Concepts that had seemed outdated and restrictive when he was younger, but now carried a weight he hadn't fully appreciated. She had managed to balance personal fulfillment with public responsibility for more than 7 decades, finding ways to be authentic while still serving something larger than herself. Harry also thought about his mother and the lessons her life and death had taught him about the price of fame and the importance of protecting what mattered most. Princess Diana had fought for causes she believed in and had spoken truth to power in ways that changed the world. But she had also paid a devastating personal price for her public battles, and Harry wondered if he was repeating some of her mistakes while missing the deeper wisdom of her example. Most painfully, he thought about William and Catherine and the life they were building together. They had found a way to modernize the monarchy while respecting its traditions, to raise their children with both privilege and purpose, to serve the public while protecting their private family life. They weren't perfect, but they had achieved the kind of balance that Harry had convinced himself was impossible. His phone rang, interrupting his solitary reflection. The caller ID showed his father's number, and Harry answered without hesitation. "Harry, I hope I'm not calling at a bad time," Charles said, his voice carrying clearly across the thousands of miles between them. "No, Dad. Actually, your timing is perfect." They talked for nearly an hour, a conversation that meandered through childhood memories, current events, and carefully shared thoughts about the future. Charles didn't pressure Harry for decisions or repeat the ultimatum that William and Catherine had delivered. Instead, he simply reminded his son that families could disagree while still loving each other, and that sometimes the bravest thing was admitting when a path wasn't leading where you had hoped it would. "I've been thinking about Granny a lot," Harry admitted as their conversation wound down. "As have I," Charles replied. "She had a remarkable ability to see the long view, to understand that temporary conflicts were less important than lasting relationships." After hanging up, Harry continued his walk along the beach as the sun set over the Pacific. The conversation with his father had clarified something important. His family wasn't asking him to abandon his principles or silence his voice completely. They were asking him to find a way to live authentically while also considering the impact of his choices on people he claimed to love. When Harry finally returned home, he found his wife waiting for him with a cup of tea and the patient expression of someone who understood that major life decisions couldn't be rushed. They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, watching their dogs play in the backyard they had designed as their private sanctuary. "I think I need to go back," Harry said finally.
To England?
To who I used to be before all of this got so complicated. His wife reached over and took his hand. "What does that mean exactly?"
Harry looked at her. This woman who had chosen to build a life with him despite all the complications and contradictions that came with his heritage.
"I think it means I need to stop running from my family and figure out how to be part of it again, even if that means giving up some of the things I thought I wanted." The decision, once spoken aloud, felt both terrifying and liberating. Harry knew that changing course now would mean difficult conversations with publishers, disappointing people who had supported his independence, and facing critics who would view any reconciliation as weakness or calculation. But as he sat there holding his wife's hand in the home they had built together, Harry realized that the price of continued conflict was higher than the price of swallowing his pride. His grandmother had understood something about legacy that he was only beginning to grasp. The most important inheritance wasn't money or titles or public platforms, but relationships that endured beyond temporary disagreements. The road back to his family wouldn't be easy, and there would be conditions and compromises that challenged his sense of independence. But for the first time since leaving England, Harry felt like he was moving towards something meaningful rather than running away from something painful. Tomorrow, he would begin the difficult process of unwinding commitments and renegotiating relationships. Tonight, he would simply sit with the peace that came from finally knowing which direction he wanted to go. The morning after Harry's decision brought a cascade of phone calls that would test his resolve before he had even begun to act on it. His publisher was the first to reach him, their voice tight with barely controlled panic as they discussed the implications of any delays to his book promotion tour. Millions of dollars in advance sales, international distribution deals, and coordinated media campaigns hung in the balance of his uncertainty. "Harry, I need you to understand the magnitude of what you're suggesting. His editor explained during an emergency video conference that included his agent, his publicist, and 2 attorneys.
This isn't just about one book.
This is about your entire brand, as someone willing to tell difficult truths about powerful institutions. His publicist leaned into the camera with the intense focus of someone whose reputation was built on managing celebrities through crisis moments. If you start backing down from controversial content now, especially after everything we've built around your authenticity and courage, it will undermine everything we've accomplished. Harry listened to their arguments with growing detachment, realizing how thoroughly his personal journey had become a corporate enterprise. These people were well-intentioned and professionally competent, but they were invested in a version of Harry that he was no longer sure he wanted to be. Their success depended on his willingness to maintain a state of conflict with his family, and that dependence had become its own trap. "I understand your concerns," Harry said finally, "but I need to consider what's best for my long-term relationships, not just my short-term career prospects." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken implications about contractual obligations and financial commitments. His agent, a veteran of Hollywood deal-making who had guided Harry through his transition to American media, spoke with the careful precision of someone delivering bad news. "Harry, I have to ask you to really think about what you're risking here. The opportunity to tell your story on your own terms doesn't come twice. If you step back now, you may never get another chance to shape the narrative about your life and your family's treatment of you." But even as his professional team outlined the costs of changing course, Harry felt increasingly certain that those costs were worth paying. The narrative they had helped him build was compelling and profitable, but it was also keeping him trapped in a version of the past that prevented him from moving forward. His wife's response to his decision was more nuanced than his team's panic. She had supported his departure from royal life and understood the pain that had driven his public criticism of his family, but she had also watched him become increasingly unhappy despite his public success. "I want you to be happy," she told him during a long walk through their neighborhood. "If that means finding a way back to your family, then we'll figure out how to make that work." Her support was exactly what Harry needed to begin the delicate process of reaching out to William and Catherine. The phone call he made that evening was perhaps the most difficult of his adult life, requiring him to set aside years of accumulated grievances and speak with humility he hadn't shown in months. "William, it's Harry. I've been thinking about our conversation at Kensington Palace, and I wonder if we could talk again." The pause before William's response felt endless. "What did you want to discuss?" "I think you and Catherine were right about needing to choose. I'd like to explore what it might look like to step back from some of the more public criticism while finding ways to maintain my independence." Another pause, this one slightly shorter. "That's a conversation worth having, but it would need to include concrete changes, not just good intentions." Over the following weeks, Harry engaged in a series of careful negotiations that felt like diplomatic talks between warring nations. William and Catherine, with King Charles's knowledge and support, presented a clear framework for reconciliation that required significant sacrifices from Harry while offering genuine opportunities for renewed family connection. The terms were non-negotiable. Harry would need to cancel his planned book tour and renegotiate his publishing contract to remove the most damaging revelations about private family conversations. He would stop giving interviews that criticized the monarchy or specific family members. His future public statements would be reviewed by palace communication staff to ensure they didn't undermine ongoing royal initiatives. In exchange, Harry would be welcomed back to family gatherings and included in significant royal events. He would be consulted on matters affecting his public role and given opportunities to pursue charitable work that aligned with royal priorities. Most importantly, his children would grow up knowing their extended family rather than being caught in an endless cycle of public conflict. The negotiations were handled through intermediaries and formal communications that felt nothing like the casual family conversations Harry remembered from his youth. Every detail was carefully documented, every commitment precisely worded, every expectation clearly defined. It was a business arrangement as much as a family reconciliation, which felt both necessary and heartbreaking. Harry's American advisors fought the proposed terms with the intensity of lawyers representing a client in a hostile takeover. They argued that he was giving up too much leverage, surrendering too much independence, and accepting restrictions that could damage his future earning potential. Their objections were professionally sound and personally devastating, highlighting how thoroughly his family relationships had become entangled with his financial interests. "You're not just Harry's family," his lead attorney pointed out during one particularly tense conference call that included both American and British legal representatives. You're Harry's former employers, current competitors, and potential future business partners. This creates conflicts of interest that need to be carefully managed. The clinical language of legal negotiations seemed to strip all warmth and humanity from relationships that had once been defined by love and shared experience. Harry found himself wondering if the damage done over the past few years was too extensive to repair. If too many words had been spoken and too many bridges burned to allow for genuine reconciliation. The turning point came during a private conversation with Catherine that happened almost by accident. Harry had called to discuss some technical details about his upcoming public statement announcing the end of his book tour, but their conversation gradually moved beyond logistics to more personal territory. "Harry, I want you to know that this isn't about punishment or control," Catherine said, her voice carrying a warmth that had been absent from their formal negotiations. "We genuinely miss you. The children ask about their uncle constantly, and William struggles with the distance between you more than he'll admit." For the first time in months, Harry heard genuine emotion in Catherine's voice rather than careful diplomacy. "I miss you too," he admitted. "I miss all of you. I just don't know if we can get back to where we used to be." "Maybe we can't," Catherine replied. "Maybe we need to build something new instead of trying to recreate something old. But we can't do that while we're still fighting each other in public." The conversation marked a subtle shift in the reconciliation process. While the formal terms remained the same, the spirit behind them became more collaborative and less punitive. Harry began to see the restrictions not as limitations on his freedom, but as necessary boundaries that would protect relationships he valued more than his public platform. His public statement announcing the end of his book promotion tour was carefully crafted to avoid any appearance of capitulation, while honestly acknowledging his desire to prioritize family relationships. The media response was immediate and intense, with speculation about palace pressure, financial settlements, and hidden agreements dominating headlines for weeks. Harry weathered the criticism and conspiracy theories with help from his wife and a small circle of trusted friends who understood the complexity of his situation. The hardest part was disappointing supporters who had viewed his criticism of the royal family as brave truth-telling and now saw his reconciliation as betrayal. "You can't please everyone," his father reminded him during one of their increasingly frequent phone calls. "The question is whether you're making decisions based on what you think is right or what you think will be popular." As Harry began the practical work of extracting himself from contractual obligations and renegotiating business relationships, he felt a mixture of relief and anxiety about the future. He was giving up significant income and public influence, but he was also freeing himself from the exhausting work of maintaining public conflict with people he loved. The road back to his family was going to be longer and more complicated than he had initially hoped. Trust would need to be rebuilt gradually through actions rather than words. Public perception would need to be managed carefully to avoid the appearance that anyone had won or lost this very public family dispute. But for the first time since leaving England, Harry felt like he was moving towards something positive rather than running away from something painful. The price of reconciliation was high, but the cost of continued estrangement had proven even higher. 6 months after Harry's decision to step back from his public criticism of the royal family, the true test of his reconciliation came with an unexpected invitation. King Charles was hosting a private family gathering at Balmoral to celebrate what would have been the Queen's 100th birthday, and Harry found himself holding an invitation that felt like both an olive branch and a final exam. The invitation was formal but warm, written in his father's distinctive handwriting rather than dictated to a secretary. It explicitly included his wife and children, making clear that this wasn't just about Harry's individual return to the family fold, but about integrating his American-based household into the broader royal circle. The gesture was significant, but Harry understood that acceptance would mean facing family members who had watched his very public journey away from and back toward the institution they had devoted their lives to serving. The weeks leading up to the gathering were filled with careful preparations that went far beyond choosing appropriate clothing. Harry worked with both his American team and palace communications staff to ensure that his presence wouldn't create unwanted media attention or diplomatic complications. Every detail was considered, from arrival and departure times, to the specific activities he would and wouldn't participate in during the weekend. His children were excited about the trip in the uncomplicated way that only children could be. They remembered their royal relatives with fondness rather than the political complexity that had dominated adult conversations, and their enthusiasm reminded Harry of what he had been fighting to protect and restore. Watching his daughter practice her curtsy for her grandfather and his son study maps of the Balmoral estate, Harry felt a renewed sense of purpose about his decision to prioritize family relationships over public platforms. The flight to Scotland was deliberately low-key, with Harry's family travelling on a commercial flight rather than the private jets that had once been routine. The decision was partly financial. His reduced income from stepping back from book deals and speaking engagements had required some lifestyle adjustments, but it was also symbolic. He wanted to approach this reunion with humility, rather than the sense of entitlement that had characterized some of his earlier interactions with his family. Balmoral in early autumn was exactly as Harry remembered from childhood visits. The Scottish Highlands wrapped in the kind of misty beauty that had inspired generations of romantic poetry. As their car wound through the familiar countryside toward the castle, Harry felt a complicated mixture of homecoming and nervousness that intensified with each passing mile. King Charles met them at the entrance personally, his embrace of Harry warm and sustained in a way that spoke of genuine relief rather than mere courtesy. The past months of careful phone conversations and formal negotiations melted away in that moment, replaced by the simple reality of a father welcoming his son home. His father's greeting of Harry's wife and children was equally warm, with particular attention paid to helping the children feel comfortable in the imposing Scottish castle. William and Catherine arrived later that afternoon with their own children, and the moment Harry had been both anticipating and dreading finally arrived. The brothers' greeting was cordial but careful, watched closely by children who sensed the importance of this interaction without understanding its full context. Catherine's hug lasted longer than protocol required, and Harry interpreted this as a sign that their private phone conversations had indeed marked a genuine shift in their relationship. The extended family gathering that evening revealed how much Harry's absence had created a visible gap in the family dynamic. His cousins and their children had continued growing and changing during his years of estrangement, and Harry found himself catching up on births, marriages, career changes, and personal milestones that he had missed while focused on his public battles with the institution. Princess Anne, characteristically direct, approached Harry during the pre-dinner reception with her typical no-nonsense manner. "You look better," she observed without preamble, "happier. Less angry." "I feel better," Harry replied honestly. "It turns out that fighting with your family all the time is exhausting." "Fighting with anyone all the time is exhausting," Anne replied. "The question is whether you've learned that lesson permanently or just temporarily." The dinner conversation was carefully steered away from controversial topics, focusing instead on shared interests like conservation, military charities, and the challenges of raising children in unusual circumstances. Harry found himself appreciating the skill with which his family members navigated potentially difficult topics while still maintaining genuine conversation. It was a reminder of the diplomatic abilities that royal training had instilled in all of them, skills he had perhaps undervalued during his years of deliberate provocation. The real breakthrough came the following morning during a private walk with William around the estate. Without the presence of children, staff, or other family members, the brothers were finally able to have the honest conversation that had been years in the making. "I want you to know that I never stopped hoping we'd find our way back to each other," William said as they paused beside a stream that had been one of their childhood adventure destinations.
But I also want you to understand why we had to draw such clear boundaries. Harry nodded, understanding that this was both an olive branch and a final explanation.
"I think I needed those boundaries, even though I resented them at the time. I was spiraling, and I couldn't see it. We all make mistakes when we're in pain," William replied. "But some mistakes have consequences that last longer than others." They talked for more than an hour, covering years of accumulated grievances and misunderstandings, with the kind of honesty that had been impossible when every conversation was potentially going to become public. Harry apologized for specific statements and actions that had caused unnecessary pain, while William acknowledged ways that the family could have been more supportive during Harry's struggles with his role and responsibilities. "I can't promise that we'll never disagree again," William said as they headed back toward the castle. "But I can promise that we'll handle our disagreements like family members rather than public enemies." The weekend included activities that reinforced the normalcy that Harry had been seeking. Family walks, casual meals, children playing together, and long conversations about everything except royal duties and public responsibilities. His daughter formed an immediate bond with her cousin Princess Charlotte, while his son was fascinated by the castle's history and his grandfather's stories about growing up in such an unusual environment. Harry found particular satisfaction in watching his father with the grandchildren. King Charles had always been more comfortable with children than with many adult responsibilities, and his genuine delight in having the family together was evident in every interaction. The sight of his father reading bedtime stories to a mixture of grandchildren who spanned 2 continents and multiple cultural backgrounds felt like a glimpse of the future Harry was now working to build. Catherine approached Harry privately on the final evening of their visit, choosing a moment when they could speak without being overheard or interrupted. "I want you to know that your decision to step back from the book tour meant a lot to William. even though he'll never say so directly. It was the right thing to do, Harry replied. I just wish it hadn't taken me so long to see that. Sometimes we have to go far away from something to understand how much we actually value it, Catherine said. What matters is that you found your way back. As Harry's family prepared to return to California, the goodbyes carried none of the tension and uncertainty that had characterized their arrival. Plans were made for future visits both to Scotland and to California. His children extracted promises about upcoming family celebrations they could attend, and Harry found himself being consulted about charitable initiatives he might want to support from his American base. The flight home gave Harry time to reflect on how much had changed in just a few days. The conversations with William and Catherine had resolved years of accumulated tension, but more importantly, they had established a foundation for moving forward. His children had experienced their royal heritage as something positive and enriching rather than as a source of family conflict. Back in California, Harry began the work of rebuilding his public life around different priorities. Instead of memoir promotion and critical interviews, he focused on charitable work that aligned with his family's broader mission. His speaking engagements emphasized veterans' issues and mental health awareness, without the personal attacks on royal institutions that had previously characterized his public statements. The media coverage of his transformation was predictably cynical, with various commentators speculating about palace pressure, financial incentives, and hidden agreements. Harry learned to ignore these interpretations, understanding that public perception would eventually catch up with the reality of his changed priorities. His wife adapted to their new circumstances with the grace that had originally attracted Harry to her. She understood that their reduced public profile and modified income stream were prices worth paying for family peace and personal happiness. Their children adjusted to having extended family relationships that weren't complicated by adult conflicts and media speculation. A year after the Balmoral gathering, Harry received another handwritten invitation from his father. This time, it was for a working visit to discuss potential charitable collaborations between Harry's American Foundation and various royal patronages. The invitation represented something Harry had thought might be impossible, a way to serve others while honoring his family connections. As Harry prepared for this new phase of his relationship with his family, he reflected on everything he had learned about the difference between independence and isolation, between authentic truth-telling and performative rebellion. The path he had chosen wasn't easier than the one he had been on, but it was more sustainable and more aligned with his deeper values. The prince who boarded the plane for London was different from the one who had left in such dramatic fashion years earlier. He had learned that sometimes the most radical thing you can do is choose forgiveness over grievance, family loyalty over public validation, and private peace over public platform. The cost of that choice had been significant, but the benefits were proving to be immeasurable. Harry's story was far from over, but for the first time in years, he felt like he was writing it in collaboration with people he loved, rather than in opposition to them. And that, he realized, was the kind of ending that his grandmother would have understood and approved of, not perfect, not without complications, but ultimately guided by love and service, rather than anger and resentment.